2000, Michael Swango, a doctor, was convicted for murdering patients in New York and Ohio. If connected to all suspicious deaths since 1983, he could be history's most prolific serial killer, with estimates ranging from 35 to 60 victims. Swango's intercontinental killing spree lasted from 1983 to 1997. Pulitzer Prize winner James B. Stewart, in Blind Eye, exposes the systemic flaws that allowed Swango to evade justice. Despite forewarnings from nurses, hospital administrators did little, accepting Swango's explanations over incriminating records as he moved from institution to institution. Nurses and patients saw the warning signs, but doctors dismissed their concerns. Swango moved from institution to institution unchecked, and when his history was reviewed, his own testimony outweighed incriminating records. After Swango's arrest, Stewart remarked that the medical profession blindly trusted its own, unable to police itself effectively. Swango's charm and appearance helped. Blonde, blue-eyed, and seemingly sincere, he was well liked by colleagues. Swango was fully aware of his charm, using it to hide his deceit. Loretta Lynch, U.S. District Attorney, remarked that Swango, instead of healing, manipulated hospital administrators, gaining their trust and taking lives. His fellow medical students at Southern Illinois University would simply say, "He's nuts." Southern Illinois University, one of the state's esteemed institutions, was the first in the nation to create a comprehensive medical curriculum. It was rigorous, and the bond between students helped them endure the intense workload. Michael Swango stood out, not in a good way. He spent more time as an ambulance attendant than attending classes. Despite his intelligence, his lack of discipline, arrogance, and poor skills alienated him from classmates. Swango exhibited strange behavior. When corrected, he would drop to the floor and do push-ups, a military-style punishment, unusual for civilian pre-med students. Medical students are trained to conduct histories and physicals under supervision, accurately summarizing patient health and planning care. Swango failed at conducting histories and physicals. His classmates noticed his unsettling attitude toward death. He would scratch "died" across charts, and when asked about it, he simply replied, "Death happens." Swango's patients died so frequently that his peers nicknamed him 00 Swango, a parody of James Bond, as if he had a license to kill. Swango's parents, Muriel and Virgil, had little trouble with him. He was well-mannered, wore suits, and excelled in school, topping the honor roll each semester. Swango graduated as valedictorian in 1972 and pursued a degree in music. However, by sophomore year, he changed, trading his suit for military fatigues. Swango painted his car army green and became obsessed with violence. He collected clippings of tragic events, from car crashes to military coups. Eventually, he left school to join the Marine Corps. Swango's sudden decision shocked his friends and his mother, who had endured years of being a lonely housewife while Virgil was off serving in Vietnam. One stint with the Marines was enough. Swango was honorably discharged in 1976 and returned home to study medicine, abandoning his interest in music. Swango enrolled in Quincy College, majoring in biology and chemistry, while working as an ambulance attendant. He maintained just below an A average. Swango's senior thesis was praised for its thoroughness, but it raised concerns, detailing a true-life poison murder in London. Swango passed the medical college test with ease, won awards, and graduated summa cum laude, securing a top spot on Southern Illinois University's pre-med list. Swango worked for the American Ambulance Service, not for experience, but because he was fascinated by the gore and chaos. It excited him. In 1982, during his last year at SIU, Swango's father passed away. Though never close, he attended the funeral out of respect. After the funeral, Swango's mother gave him a scrapbook she found among his father's belongings, filled with columns and photos of disasters, similar to the one Swango had already started. Swango's response to the scrapbook? "Hell, I guess Dad wasn't such a bad guy after all." Inspired, he began adding to his own collection from local papers. Swango would have graduated in June 1982, but he failed a major phase of his curriculum, often disappearing or showing up late during his OBGYN rotation. His supervisor noticed that Swango performed patient visits too quickly, and one day discovered he had not examined a patient at all. Swango's detailed reports raised suspicion. His supervisor believed he was either fabricating or plagiarizing. His deceit was deemed unforgivable by the board. Swango's internship offer from the University of Iowa was at stake, but a compromise was reached. He would not be expelled if he repeated the OBGYN rotations. By the time Swango received his diploma in April 1983, he had a poor reputation. His dean's letter described him as inept. Despite his poor reputation, Ohio State University offered Swango a year-long internship in general surgery. followed by a residency in neurosurgery. Ohio State University's medical center was one of the best, only accepting top pre-med graduates. Despite this, Swango's shortcomings soon surfaced. The doctor in charge of transplant surgery threatened to fail Swango, believing he was not competent, and criticized his brusque, indifferent manner with patients. Swango's bedside manner was troubling. Fellow interns and residents noticed he often seemed lost during patient evaluations. Swango's conversations were often unrelated. One doctor noted his strange preoccupation with Nazi history and the genocide of Jews. On January 31st, 1984, Swango entered Ruth Barrick's room to check her IV. Nurse Deborah Kennedy found it strange, as routine checks were usually done earlier by doctors. 20 minutes later, Kennedy returned to find Swango gone and the patient, Barrick, turning blue and suffocating. Doctors rushed in and were able to resuscitate her. A week later, Nurse Ann Ritchie noticed an abnormal reading on Barrick's IV. She called for a doctor, and Swango responded. Swango took longer than expected, and when Ritchie peeked in to ask, he seemed annoyed and said there was no problem. When Swango left, Ritchie returned to find Barrick had turned blue. Despite emergency treatment, she died. Swango stood by, unaffected. Swango's only comment during the procedure: "That's so disgusting," referring to the nurse's resuscitation efforts. The next evening, student nurse Carolyn Beery checked on Rena Cooper, an elderly patient recovering from back surgery. When she entered the room, Beery saw Swango injecting something into Cooper's IV. Beery assumed Swango was freeing a blockage, but Swango said nothing and left immediately when he saw her watching. Moments later, Cooper began shaking violently, choking as she turned blue. Doctors and nurses rushed in, and after 15 minutes, resuscitated her. The medics noticed Cooper's color returning. Though still unable to speak, she motioned for a notebook and pencil. Cooper wrote, "Someone gave me something in my IV. It paralyzed me. Lungs, heart, speech." Cooper later recalled, "There was no feeling in her body." A voice said, "When it reaches your other elbow, you'll die." She shook the bed rail with her right hand. The next morning, when Cooper was able to speak, she described the person with the syringe. Her description matched Swango, tall, blonde. When confronted, Swango denied ever being near Cooper's room, but the nurses were unconvinced. Nurse Joe Risley saw Swango darting out of a lavatory in an unoccupied room immediately after the incident. In the lavatory, Risley found a wet syringe. He wrapped it in tissue and handed it to Nurse Lily Jordan. With the syringe in their possession and Beery standing by her story, the nurses in Rhodes Hall began comparing notes. Since Swango's appointment, there had been an unusual increase in the number of deaths, more in a few weeks than in the entire year. In each case, the patient had been doing well. None had been diagnosed with life-threatening illnesses. Besides Ruth Barrick, 6 others had died, including 19-year-old Cynthia Ann McGee, 21-year-old Richard DeLong, and 47-year-old Rain Walker, all unexpectedly. Swango had been the floor intern at the time of every death. Assistant Director of Nursing, Jan Dixon, knew it was time to present their suspicions to neurosurgery professor Joseph Goodman. After Dixon relayed her concerns and statements from her staff, she was shocked to find Dr. Goodman unsympathetic. Goodman hinted that the nurses should focus on their work and avoid rumors. He promised to investigate, but Dixon and the staff doubted anything would come of it. They knew the reason. Bad publicity and lawsuits could ruin the institution. The issue of legal liability was sensitive at Ohio State. Being largely self-insured, judgments against the hospital or university were paid by the university. Goodman's February 9th investigation was incomplete. He interviewed Cooper and reviewed files, but never spoke to doctors or nurses who responded to the emergencies. He never spoke to nurses Kennedy, Beery, or Ritchie, nor did he examine the syringe found in the washroom. After consulting with hospital attorneys and other officials, Goodman concluded that Swango was a victim of bad press. Rena Cooper, disturbed by the light judgment on Swango, couldn't believe investigators concluded her description didn't match him. Her account of Swango was transformed, from a tall blonde man to a short female. Cooper felt words were being put in her mouth. Gossip subsided just as unexplainable deaths began in Doane Hall, where Swango had transferred. February 19th, 1984. 72-year-old Charlotte Warner was found dead in her room, though she had been expected to go home the next day. On February 19th, Evelyn Perrinet began bleeding profusely after being examined by Swango. The resident physician had no explanation for the hemorrhaging. On February 20th, Anna Mae Popko, 22, recovering from an intestinal operation, allowed Swango to give her a shot to supposedly increase her blood pressure. Popko's mother didn't understand why Swango wanted to be alone in the room, but after a brief argument, she relented. Not long after, Swango approached Mrs. Popko, saying, "She's dead now. You can go look at her." In late February, a residency review committee questioned Swango's ability to become a resident doctor. His performance was poor, and Ohio State decided not to accept him as a resident after June. Swango left angrily after being notified in March. Ohio State would later regret not pursuing the nurse's claims as Swango became involved in further legal issues. In the late 1990s, Swango became a target of national suspicion. The press criticized OSU for not cleaning up the mess created when they bungled the investigation and gave Swango a pass. In response to ABC News, OSU admitted they should have called in outside police authorities to investigate. Hindsight didn't help the patients who died. In 1984, the Ohio State Medical Board, investigating Swango for a medical license, learned of his behavioral issues and possible link to deaths. Surgery director Dr. Larry Carey expressed concerns about Swango to the board, citing his run-ins with hospital staff and the Rena Cooper incident. Despite negative reports, the medical board granted Swango a license to practice medicine in Ohio. Swango, angry or frightened by his peers' treatment, left Ohio and returned to Quincy, Illinois. Swango told his family he was the victim of a personality clash and planned to seek a license to practice medicine in his home state. In Quincy, Swango got a job as a paramedic with Adams County Ambulance Corps, avoiding his old employer, American Ambulance, due to bad terms. Swango had actually been fired for making a coronary victim walk to the ambulance. Adams Ambulance, unaware of his past, thought he was a valuable asset. Ambulance Corps members worked 24-hour shifts, sharing quarters at Blessing Hospital. Working closely, the Ambulance Corps was like a fraternity, knowing each other well, but Swango stood apart from the group. From the start, Swango was considered the Looney Tune of the group. He openly admitted that violence excited him. The others assumed this was why Swango became a paramedic, to surround himself with blood, guts, and the intense moments of emergency work. Fellow corpsmen found Swango's oddness mostly harmless. They even appreciated his dark humor to break the monotony during slow periods. Despite his odd behavior, Swango was a skilled technician, with more practical experience than the rest combined, so his strange remarks were often overlooked. But Swango sometimes crossed the line, like when he said poison was the best murder tool, or that he loved telling parents their child had just died. One evening, Swango shared a disturbing fantasy, describing a school bus crash with a gasoline truck. In his fantasy, another truck rams the bus, sending kids flying through the air, burning along a barbed wire fence. Despite his gruesome stories, Swango was seen as all talk, until the donut incident, which made his comrades much more wary. Corps members took turns bringing in treats. Donuts were especially popular with the morning coffee. One morning, when Swango brought donuts, several men became violently ill. All of them had to leave work. Only later did they realize Swango hadn't eaten any of the donuts. When questioned later, Swango denied any wrongdoing. The next evening, Swango and Unmissig worked an emergency detail at a high school football game. Near halftime, Swango offered to buy himself and Unmissig a cola. Unmissig thanked him and held Swango's seat. After sipping the cola, Unmissig experienced severe cramping. Swango drove him home, where he spent 3 days in bed with nausea, dizziness, and a headache. Swango quickly became a suspect. No one would drink or eat anything around him anymore. One afternoon, Swango invited the group for a soda. Greg Myers, unaware of the others' suspicions, agreed to join him. Myers knew the soda would come from a pop dispenser. He tossed Swango some change and waited. When Swango returned, Myers noticed the can was already opened. Swango smiled and said, "Why not?" Despite his instincts, Myers sipped the soda. Minutes later, he experienced stomach pains and the same symptoms Unmissig had earlier. Once again, an Adams County paramedic had to be rushed home. Another mysterious ailment. After this latest incident, his co-workers checked Swango's duffel bag. Inside, they found a box of taro ant poison. The label revealed the poison was mainly arsenic, causing the exact symptoms they'd all experienced. They decided to set a trap. The men left a fresh pot of iced tea out for Swango. After he left, they poured it into another container and washed out the pot. They brought the tea to the coroner, who sent it to an FBI lab. Tests confirmed traces of poison. Before the week ended, the sheriff searched Swango's apartment, uncovering vials, syringes, and a book on DIY murder, the poor man's James Bond. The police report described an eerie mini-lab with chemicals, poisons, handwritten recipes, handguns, and knives. Swango was arrested and charged with 7 counts of aggravated battery. His trial began on April 22, 1985, and moved quickly. Defense lawyer Dan Cook had little to work with. Prosecutors uncovered Swango's shady history from Ohio State, adding to the suspicion. Cook's defense rested on the claim that the case was built on circumstantial evidence. The prosecution's witnesses included Swango's co-workers who had fallen ill, the coroner, and the lab technician who tested the poisoned tea. Swango was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years in the Centralia Correctional Center. His application for a medical license in Illinois was revoked. Judge Cashman believed Swango used the Adams County paramedics as guinea pigs for larger poisoning schemes. In a 1999 interview, Cashman stated that Swango likely wanted to take people to the edge of death. If he wanted to kill them, he had enough arsenic. Swango's arrest sparked national media attention. Ohio State University faced criticism for unleashing a suspected poisoner. James Meeks, OSU's Dean of Law, led an investigation and published results that conceded to the critics. The Meeks report concluded that the school had been negligent in its duty to the community. Reporter John Stossel, intrigued by Swango's alleged crimes, interviewed him in prison for the show 2020. The interview was rapid fire. Stossel questioned Swango about the poisons found in his apartment, his shady Ohio internship, and his response to the situation. Swango maintained his innocence throughout the interview, resenting the monster image painted by the press, saying, "I did not do these things." Swango claimed he wasn't the type of person to commit such acts. When told the public feared his release, he grimaced and said, "There's certainly no reason for anyone to be scared of me." On August 21, 1987, Swango was released on good behavior after serving 2 years of his 5-year sentence, followed by a year of probation. By the time of his release, the media furor had died down. Swango preferred the quiet and left Illinois to avoid local gossip. He moved to Newport News, Virginia, to escape his past. But it still lingered. Swango was denied a medical license in Virginia. Instead, he became a job counselor at the Career Development Center. His time as a counselor was short. His coworkers disapproved of him working on his disaster scrapbook at his desk. His next job as a lab technician at Atacol Services lasted longer. It was dull, but it paid well, and the president liked him. His coworkers had forgotten his 2020 scandal. They had no hesitation accompanying him at lunch, even after several Atacol employees fell ill from food poisoning. Kristen Kinney, a beautiful 26-year-old redhead, met Swango in 1991 at Newport News Riverside Hospital. Kristen was a nurse, and Swango was taking a refresher course. Though engaged to another doctor, she and Swango eventually became an item. Her friends, who called her KK, worried about the fast-moving romance. Some warned her after learning about Swango's rejected hospital application due to a past scandal. Kristen laughed off their concerns. Meanwhile, Swango was eager to get back into practice and applied to medical centers across the country. While maintaining his relationship with KK, Swango continued sending resumes. In September 1991, he got a call from the University of South Dakota. Dr. Anthony Salem, director of the residency program, was interested. He praised Swango's resume, but asked him to clarify certain parts of his past. The issue was a battery conviction in Illinois. Swango lied, claiming it was due to a barroom brawl where people got hurt. Swango claimed he was the fall guy, but added that his practicing rights were restored in Virginia. Salem, appreciating the honesty, accepted that accidents happen. Salem invited Swango to Sioux Falls for an interview. Kristen kissed him goodbye, and he flew out for the meeting on October 3rd. Swango's interview with a group of internists focused on his background in internal medicine, the first step in a long selection process. Amazingly, no one questioned him about the battery charges or contacted police in Quincy to verify the details. By early 1992, the list of candidates was narrowed down. Despite mixed reviews, Swango's name remained in the running. After more deliberation, Swango was officially accepted for a residency starting in June. Swango proposed to KK after receiving the good news. She accepted, and they planned to move to Sioux Falls and live together. Kristen was hired as an RN at the Royal C. Johnson Veterans Memorial Hospital and looked forward to making a difference. Kristen's mother and stepfather, Sharon and Al Cooper, were skeptical. Like her friends, they were concerned about the gaps in Swango's past. Sharon later admitted she dismissed her worries, convincing herself Swango was the answer for Kristen. Al mentioned that Kristen's failed marriage left her longing for another chance to marry and have children. In Sioux Falls, the Coopers' concerns seemed unfounded. Swango excelled, earning a reputation as one of the best emergency doctors. Kristen brought a lively personality and energy to the VA hospital. She quickly became well-liked and respected by nurses and doctors alike. Together, KK and Swango turned heads and sparked envy. By October 1992, Swango had grown overconfident. Despite being unlicensed and having lied to obtain his internship, Swango boldly applied for membership in the American Medical Association. He must have assumed they wouldn't check his credentials. He was wrong. The AMA's routine background check revealed that Swango's conviction in Quincy wasn't due to a barroom brawl. When Judge Cashman, who tried Swango in 1985, heard the AMA was inquiring about Swango working as a doctor again, he was shocked. Cashman immediately called AMA official Nancy Watson and told her the truth. She passed it to her superior, who relayed it to Dr. Robert Talley at the University of South Dakota. As Talley heard the bad news about Swango, 2020 rebroadcast John Stossel's 1986 interview with him from the Centralia Correctional Center. Nurses, doctors, and patients who knew Swango saw his face on TV, with a voiceover suggesting he might have poisoned donuts with ant poison. The program's impact was devastating. Kristen saw it and broke down, but Swango, who had just been dismissed, offered no comfort or answers. Once again, Swango's world was shaken. He ranted about defamation, claiming he was being railroaded, but did nothing to comfort Kristen. Feeling abandoned, KK hid from reporters badgering her about Swango. The humiliation of their comments was almost worse than the truth of his crimes. At a hospital Christmas party, KK noticed the host's husband following Swango closely, especially near the punch bowl and food. Kristen began suffering severe, pounding headaches, worse than any migraines she had ever experienced. At first, Kristen blamed the headaches on tension, but deep down she wondered if Swango was putting something in her food. Being a skilled nurse, Kristen feared the worst. Eventually, she couldn't take it anymore and fled to her mother's house in Virginia. Once away from Swango, her headaches disappeared. She still loved him and perhaps believed he was innocent, hoping everything would turn out fine. She struggled to explain why the headaches disappeared after leaving. She wrestled with her emotions until the truth became too hard to bear. Kristen tragically took her own life. Police found a note addressed to her mother and Al Cooper, expressing her love and desire for peace. Kristen's note said she found life a constant struggle, but had finally found peace of mind. Kristen's final words to Michael were, "I love you more. You're the most precious man I've ever known." Kristen was gone. By June 1993, Swango had moved on to New York, focusing on his own concerns. Swango secured another position, this time in a psychiatric residency at the State University of New York, Stony Brook Medical School. During the spring interview, when asked about his Illinois conviction, Swango reused the barroom brawl lie and showed his forged Virginia pardon. Swango impressed Dr. Alan Miller, director of psychiatry, and other professors. No one checked his criminal record or verified his credentials. If they had checked, they would have seen he was practicing without a license. But instead, they hired him, with his residency starting July 1st. Swango's first assignment was in internal medicine at the Veterans Administration Complex in Northport, Long Island. The hospital was a part of Stony Brook, and the local community took pride in its presence. Trouble began on Swango's first night of duty. His first patient, Dominic Bufalino, mysteriously died within hours. Teresa Bufalino couldn't understand how her husband, who was recovering from pneumonia, suddenly died of heart and organ failure. Mrs. Bufalino's shock was echoed by other relatives. Aldo Serene, Thomas Samarco, and George Ciano all died suddenly in the following months. All died of heart failure following paralysis, with Swango placing a DNR order on each of them. DNR, or do not resuscitate, meant the patient's condition was deemed fatal and inoperable. Baron Harris's case was especially dramatic, with his wife, Elsie, later becoming one of Swango's most vocal critics. Elderly Harris was admitted with pneumonia in September. At first, his wife approved of Swango, but her opinion of him quickly soured. Swango became distant. One night, Elsie found him in the dark, injecting something into Baron's neck. When Elsie asked about the shot, Swango unemotionally said it was vitamins, and left without further explanation. Sensing something was wrong, Elsie later asked the nurse about the shot Swango had given. The nurse was shocked, explaining that doctors don't give shots, nurses do. Baron's condition quickly worsened, and he fell into a coma. When Swango placed a DNR on his chart, Elsie demanded an explanation. Swango responded with annoyance, "His brain is virtually dead." Though Harris lived for a while, he never woke from the coma. Elsie later sued the hospital for negligence, but the case was dismissed due to lack of evidence against Swango. Since then, things changed. Kristen Kinney's parents, the Coopers, couldn't accept her suicide and believed Swango drove her to it, demanding answers. They wanted to know why Swango was still practicing, possibly hurting others like their beloved KK. Sharon Cooper shared her concerns about the elusive Swango with one of Kristen's nursing friends in South Dakota. She knew Swango had taken a residency at Stony Brook, and after learning more about him from 2020 and articles, she believed a grave error had been made. Kristen's friend was shocked to learn Swango was working again and promised to escalate Sharon's concerns, which she did. The next day, she met with Dean Robert Talley, who was horrified and immediately contacted Dr. Jordan Cohen at Stony Brook. An emergency meeting was called with Dr. Miller and Swango. When pressed, Swango admitted his prison time wasn't due to a barroom brawl, but for suspicion of poisoning paramedics. Swango was fired, but the media got wind of it. Local and national press quickly descended on Stony Brook. Families of those who died under Swango's care, including Elsie Harris, raised a public outcry. The University of New York, shaken, saw both Dr. Miller and Dr. Cohen resign by the end of the year. Cohen later reflected, telling an AP reporter that Swango was a charming pathological liar. Dr. Cohen resigned gracefully, even sending a letter to every medical school in the country, warning them about Swango. The Justice Department began quietly investigating. But Swango had already left New York for parts unknown. Agents searched for Swango in places he'd visited, following leads from friends, associates, and the Coopers. Months passed without results. In mid-1994, they finally traced Swango to his friend Bert G's home near Atlanta, Georgia. Bert G., a longtime acquaintance, was unaware of Swango's crimes or that his home was under FBI surveillance. Without an order to arrest Swango, agents shadowed his movements, waiting for the right moment. Agents panicked when they discovered Swango was working at a wastewater treatment facility connected to Atlanta's water supply. Before agents could alert local authorities, Swango suddenly left Atlanta. Within weeks, an arrest warrant was issued, charging Swango with falsifying documents to work at the Veterans Administration Hospital at Stony Brook. But Swango had disappeared again. FBI agents speculated he had either committed suicide or fled the country. The FBI, experienced with cases like Swango's, bet he had fled the country. Swango's next home was Zimbabwe, southern Africa, under banana-colored skies and amidst eucalyptus trees. Swango thought he'd be safe in a place far from a democracy that rejected cyanide in IV tubes or botulism in food. Swango thought Africa was too backward to notice when healthy patients died suddenly, but he was about to learn a harsh lesson. Trying to escape, Swango applied with an agency that helped English-speaking doctors find work in other countries. Swango submitted forged documents, including a fake CV, claiming his desire to practice medicine in a remote village for the sake of humanity. The Lutheran Mission Hospital in Menene thought Dr. Michael Swango would be an excellent hire after receiving his application. American doctors were rare, and Swango seemed eager to be chosen. He arrived in Africa in late 1994, picked up by Church Deacon Mpofu. Dr. Ziri questioned why such a dynamic metropolitan physician would come to Menene for so little pay. Swango claimed he loved Africa and wanted to help those who hadn't been as fortunate as him. Ziri was skeptical, but kept an eye on Swango during his orientation at Cottage Come Hospital. Swango was eager, but lacked basic skills needed in the region, like childbirth care and minor procedures. Ziri assumed Swango's lack of basic skills was due to his specialization in neurosurgery. Swango agreed to a 5-month internship at Mapilo Hospital in Bulawayo to learn the basics of local medicine and operating room techniques. Swango learned quickly, though the locals were wary of the blonde, blue-eyed doctor from Illinois. Swango's hard work impressed Dr. Chibva and Dr. King. His closest friend became Dr. Ian Lorimer, who admired Swango's calm under pressure. In May 1995, a more skilled Swango returned to Menene, often working late and improving procedures to reduce waiting times for patients. Dr. Zashiri's initial skepticism grew as he noticed Swango's attitude deteriorate and his behavior sour. Swango's work became sloppy, and the Lutheran nuns complained that he treated them with disdain, mocking the respect he was expected to show. Zashiri often discovered that Swango had taken unauthorized leave, leaving no one to care for the patients. Dr. Zashiri was capable of handling internal issues, but there was more to Swango than simple negligence. Rhoda Malamvana entered Menene Lutheran Hospital with burns and was recovering, but after Swango took over, her condition worsened. She died soon after. Many others, young and old, also collapsed during recovery and never woke up again. The cause of death was always heart failure, but Dr. Jan Larson suspected Swango was behind it. Patient Kanyas Manzazewa woke to feel Swango's needle in his arm. Soon after, he felt hot, nauseated, and paralyzed. Though nearly speechless, Manzazewa managed one scream. The nuns revived him, and he warned them to keep Swango away. Manzazewa cried, "That man, he's no good. He tried to kill me." Swango dismissed it as a hallucination. Swango denied the injection, unaware the nuns had found a needle cap near Manzazewa's cot. A few weeks later, Katazo Shava died after Swango interrupted a visit with his friends. Swango asked Shava's visitors to leave. Shortly after, they heard Shava scream. The visitors rushed back to find Shava panicking, saying Swango had injected him. Shava died that afternoon. Shava's cause of death, paralysis due to heart failure. Then Philemon Chipoko died during a foot amputation, another rare heart failure. Virginia Sabanda nearly died during childbirth. Nurses wheeled her in, and Swango took over. Sabanda cried for help in agony. The nurses stepped in to deliver the baby while she writhed. A healthy child was born, and Sabanda recovered. Later she told a nun that Swango had injected her while the nurses weren't looking. Sabanda's pain started seconds after the injection. When confronted, Swango blamed her delusions. Another death followed. Margaret Joe, a young woman undergoing a mild operation, died suddenly in the night. The nuns threatened to contact the police. Jiri called a meeting, and they decided to start an investigation. Superintendent Chakirisa obtained a warrant and searched Swango's cottage, finding a vast collection of drugs and medical tools. Syringes, some filled with liquid, and strange substances unfamiliar to Zimbabwean doctors were found. After the raid, Swango hired a top lawyer, David Coulthart, respected by local authorities. Coulthart's strong reputation convinced Swango's friends at Mpilo Hospital that his defamation claims had merit. While awaiting a hearing, Swango was allowed to return to Mpilo, but Inspector Chakirisa's case strengthened as he interviewed survivors and relatives of the dead. The drugs found in Swango's home were lethal. Soon, international communications revealed a side of Swango that no one in Maneni had known. They learned Swango had been in an American prison for poisoning co-workers and had been dismissed from several hospitals under suspicion. When Chakirisa discovered Swango was practicing at Mpilo, he contacted the Minister of Health, who ordered Swango barred from further duty. As evidence mounted, Coulthart suspected Swango was guilty. His doubts were confirmed when Swango failed to appear at a hearing in August 1996. Swango fled, hiding in Zambia and Europe for nearly a year before returning to the United States. Immigration officials had been tracking flights for months and arrested Swango when he landed at O'Hare on June 27, 1997. Swango was cuffed at the terminal, read his rights, and arrested for fraudulently entering Stony Brook and practicing without a license. From Chicago, Swango was taken to New York for trial. His arrest on fraud charges seemed as incomplete as arresting Al Capone for tax evasion. But the government had a plan. By charging Swango with even a minor crime, they could keep him in custody while building a bigger case. Though Swango had evaded the FBI by going to Africa, they never stopped pursuing him. Agents worked with international law enforcement to track Swango and build a psychological profile to understand his criminality. While no thorough psychological study of Swango exists, experts agree his profile shows narcissistic tendencies. Swango is not insane. He can tell right from wrong. While Swango was still in Africa, an FBI agent visited Judge Cashman in Illinois to gather information to help prosecutors with Swango's case. During this visit, Cashman learned of the full extent of Swango's crimes. The FBI suspected him of being responsible for up to 60 deaths. Cashman was shocked. At his hearing on July 12, 1998, Swango pleaded guilty to fraud and was given the maximum sentence at Sheridan Correctional Facility. Judge Mishler, during sentencing, ordered that Swango be barred from any duties involving food during his confinement. With Swango behind bars, the FBI sped up its investigation into his murders. Meanwhile, Africa prepared an official warrant for his arrest. The FBI had spent too many hours on Swango to let him go. They were determined to see him in an American courtroom. They interviewed relatives of patients who had died mysteriously at Stony Brook. Agents requested the exhumation of those most likely killed by Swango. These included Thomas Samarco, Aldo Serene, and George Ciano. Believed to have been given lethal heart-stopping injections by Swango, in June 2000, Swango was charged with the deaths of these men, as well as battery on Baron Harris. Though Swango likely gave Harris a shot that caused a coma, his death was technically from a larger ailment. Swango was charged with 3 counts of murder, 1 count of assault, and multiple counts of fraud and false statements. On June 17th, Swango pleaded not guilty to all charges after prosecutors recited them in court. When it seemed Swango might be released, federal prosecutors charged him with the murder of 3 VA hospital patients in Long Island in 1993. Swango's release was delayed as prosecutors prepared witnesses who had lost loved ones due to Swango's actions. Prosecutors hoped the victims' families would finally find solace and that justice would be served. In 2000, Swango pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. This judgment closed a long, tragic chapter in criminal justice.